everybody. Welcome. I want to welcome you to our February webinar. I'm Jack Gonstinsky. I serve as the Program Manager for the Lake States Fire Science Consortium. I'll be moderating the webinar this afternoon. Today we have a webinar that highlights assessing the drivers of the spring dip in foliar moisture content and the potential impact on forest fire behavior. And this is by Matt Jolly. For those who may be joining us for the first time, let me give you a little background. Lake States Fire Science Consortium is funded by the Joint Fire Science Program, and it's one of 14 regional consortia across the country. Our mission is to accelerate the awareness, understanding, and adoption of wildland fire science information by federal, tribal, state, local, and private stakeholders. For the Lake States region, this includes Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the adjacent Canadian provinces of Ontario and Manitoba. Before I get started, let me give you a little bit about Adobe Connect. First, if you'd like to ask a question, you can do that in the chat box, which is located in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. All you got to do is type in your question, click the send button. We will be monitoring the questions. We'll make sure that they are addressed. Second, we recommend that you maximize the webinar window on your computer to full screen. Be aware, though, that if you're trying to chat, you cannot have it on full screen. Finally, if you'd like to learn more about the Lake States Fire Science Consortium and what we are doing, please visit our website. You can look for information at lakestatesfiresci.net. Please sign up to receive our newsletters and announcements of other activities, and you can also follow us on Twitter and very shortly on Facebook. With that, I'm going to turn control of the webinar over to Matt. Go ahead, Matt.
Thanks, Jack. I just want to start out by saying that these webinars are a great way for all of us to connect, and this study actually came about by me giving one of these webinars, I believe 2 years ago, to a similar group of people on a different topic, and an offshoot of that was a project that John Hentz from Wisconsin DNR gladly joined up with us to do basically to get started looking at the actual drivers of the spring dip in jack pine and red pine conifer foliar moisture content that we observe in the Lake States, and but really to more so than just trying to quantify the moisture content during the dip, we actually wanted to understand what was driving that dip, and then what those changes were on the potential fire behavior in those areas. And so that's the topic of today. John's been real instrumental in getting and keeping this project running because he's the local person. We live in Missoula, Montana, so it's a little hard for us to sample for jack pine and red pine in Wisconsin frequently. But we also have some folks here, Rachel Kropp and Elliot Conrad, that have also helped with a lot of the lab tests that we'll present here. And then Jim Barnier is also Wisconsin DNR. He was real instrumental in orchestrating all this and keeping it moving. So thankful for all their participation. Basically, the objective of the study was to as I said before, to assess the main drivers of the spring dip in red pine and jack pine fuel moisture, but ultimately, understanding the drivers themselves isn't as useful to fire managers. What we want to do is really understand how those fuel changes are affecting potential fire behavior, with the ultimate goal of developing tools that managers can use to assess the onset and timing of the dip, but also to monitor conditions throughout time and better interpret what they're already doing for fuel moisture monitoring. The spring dip was first described by Van Wagner in 1967 in a publication. Possible that someone else described it earlier, but this is kind of the seminal publication, and a link to this was published on the website just to give you the background. But basically what it shows is that during the springtime, the foliar moisture content of old needles or previous year's needles dips generally pretty substantially, actually, as much as 25% over the course of a few weeks, and then recovers again. But what you'll notice is that dip coincides almost exactly with the timing of new needle emergence. So there's some interesting things with the plant physiology that are happening that are that are really affecting these changes, and that's really what we were set out to quantify, and to really add value and more predictability to this phenomenon. What Van Wagner reported in this publication is that several species follow the same patterns. So he reported it for white pine, jack pine, and red pine, and they all have this spring dip. And the more that we look at it, actually this dip occurs pretty much anywhere you have conifers. It's just that it's never actually been of interest because generally the fire seasons in other places don't correspond with this dip timing the same way that they do in the lake states. But you also notice that there's a little bit of variation in the magnitudes of the dip. So in general, he reports that jack pine, the lowest moisture recorded for jack pine is about 105%, actually is about 105%, and then for red pine it dips down below 100%, so 95 or so. And but basically one of the things that they report in terms of its impact on fire behavior is that as the foliar moisture content changes, the radiant intensity of a burning tree actually changes as well. So as the moisture content increases, the radiation released from burning foliage decreases. So that meaning that there is a foliar moisture effect on fire behavior, but as you'll see later, it may be a little bit more complicated than that. But so one of the interesting things about fuel moisture is that we have always framed our understanding of live fuel moisture based on how we believe that dead fuel moistures behave. And we essentially treat live plants as just really wet dead plants. But one of the complicating factors of that is the way that we calculate foliar moisture content or fuel moisture content. And it's because we express everything as a percentage of dry weight. So basically, in its simplest terms, any fuel moisture is just the mass of the water in a particular fuel divided by the dry weight of that fuel. Well, in a dead fuel, the dry weight never changes. So the dead fuel moisture varies as a function of the absolute water content of the fuel. Well, in a live fuel, it's much more complicated than that because we know that they're constantly growing and that there is a potential for the dry weight to change in addition to their water weight. We've just never really understood what the magnitudes of those changes could be and what the implications are for how we measure fuel moisture and what those fuel moistures actually mean. So you can see any scenario where basically if you imagine the water weight in this equation staying the same, you can change your calculated live foliar moisture content just by changing the dry weight. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind. One thing that throws people occasionally if you're not used to dealing with live fuel moistures is that they can actually go above 100%. And that's because you essentially have more water mass than you have dry mass, or more water weight than dry weight. And a live foliar moisture content of 100% indicates that you have the same amount of water mass that you have of dry mass of the fuel. So what we did is we sampled jack pine, red pine, starting before the dip and continuing on through the entire year. So we have our last sample was from January 14th, I think. So John's been diligently out collecting samples in the snow, and really it has allowed us to get a full picture of what's happening. What we quantified is the foliar moisture content the same way we always measure it. And then we measured actually the relative water content, which is a metric that physiologists use to quantify water stress, and it's expressed as a percentage of saturation instead of a percent of dry weight. So it's always bounded between 0 and 100, which is not the same as foliar moisture content. one of the things that's really important that we measured is the actual foliar density. And what that means is that we measured the mass per unit volume of an individual needle over time, and we tracked those changes over time. What that does is tell us, in essence, how the dry weight of that fuel is changing when we control for the volume of that fuel takes up, or that needle. And we also did some other things like looking at the heat content of the fuels, and we measured the chemistry of the fuels. So basically, we have a fairly standard test that will separate the fuel dry weight out into some pretty broad categories. So it tells us how much cellulose and lignin we have, how much of the needle is made up of non-structural carbohydrates, crude fat, protein, and ash. So those, but what it does is gives us basically a full picture of the fuel dry weight, but it partitions it into these categories. The last thing we did is actually measured the ignitability here in the lab using a flat flame, an open flame burner that allows us to introduce a needle to the flame and measure the time to ignition, or how long it takes for it to ignite. And we do that throughout the season to see how that time to ignition changes and how that relates to its flame. So how the flammability of the needles change as well. So what we found was that, very consistent with what Van Wagner reported, we see that over the course of the year that that indeed during the springtime the old foliage of both red pine and jack pine dips and then recovers. The recovery period seems to be a little bit longer for red pine than jack pine. You'll notice that this dip period is very pronounced and occurs right about the beginning of May and continues on through July. What you'll also see is that at the sort of trough of this dip period is the same time that we see new needles emerge. And that's important, and I'll get into that in just a minute. But what we see in terms of variability is that in general, the kind of average for old jack pine needles was 110%, and the average for old red pine needles was 104%. And the new needles actually start out very, very wet, so over 250% moisture content. But you'll notice that that needle moisture content declines as those needles mature. So basically what's happening here is that in the springtime, before new needles emerge, a tree, particularly when the weather is favorable, the trees start to photosynthesize. And as that photosynthesis continues, they have the ability to accumulate carbon in those needles, and until there's a demand for that carbon, and that demand is new needles. So as the new needles emerge, the old needles actually give up carbon to the new needles and alter their dry weight accordingly. And if we look at how that shakes out in terms of the actual chemical analysis, we'll see that emerge a little bit more. During the springtime, or during the dip period itself, we can tell that just like Van Wagner reported, actually, the dip itself is more pronounced in jack pine, but the actual magnitude of the dip is more pronounced in red pine. So the red pine moisture contents go down to 86%, and while jack pine moisture contents drop down to 96.6%. This is basically almost a 25% change in the moisture content of jack pine needles during this very narrow period of time. And you can see that the recovery period is, so this entire time frame only lasts about 2 months. And but it's really important that well, let's move on. So if we look at the actual density of the needles themselves, this is where things get pretty interesting. Is that during the springtime, coincident with the timing of the dip, we see a very strong increase in the density of the needles. So what that means is essentially that those needles are supercharging with something, basically accumulating something inside their intercellular spaces during this period, and that period is when photosynthesis actually starts. So it would lead to believe that it's some kind of carbon accumulation, and that's what we'll talk about next. But you can see that the density of the needles actually starts out in some cases below 0.4 and increases almost to 0.5. So what we see is nearly a 20% or 25% increase in the needle density for both species. And conversely, what we see for the old needles is that they actually start down really low, and their density increases as they develop. Well, what you'll notice is that this looks exactly like the previous slide that shows the moisture content, is that almost all of the changes that we see in the quote-unquote live foliar moisture content actually perfectly track changes in the particle or the needle density. Because if we take this picture in our mind and we flip it over, we go back to this slide, you'll see that it's nearly the same thing, just in reverse. So as the density increases, the moisture content decreases, and as the density increases, the moisture content decreases. So these things are inherently linked. So if we get in a little bit further into what the actual things are made of, what we see is that during that period of the dip, we see a very strong increase in the amount of starch, sugar, and crude fat in the foliage. And so we see, again, this particular curve almost exactly mimics the two previous curves. So during the springtime, before new needle emergence, when photosynthesis starts, the needles start to accumulate starch and sugar primarily, and they accumulate that until we reach a point of new needle emergence, and the plant now has a demand for those sugars, and those sugars are then given up out of the old foliage to the new foliage so that the new foliage can grow. And essentially, we see this curve track nearly perfectly with the previous curves. So we can see that the drivers of that density change are basically starch, sugar, and crude fat changes, over seasonal changes in starch, sugar, and crude fat. Well, if we look just at starch alone, this is one of the interesting things is that during the period of the spring dip, the starch content of needles is 0 for all intents and purposes. It's extremely low, usually less than 1%. During the build-up period when photosynthesis starts, the tree starts to accumulate starch in the foliage and basically reaching a maximum right at the timing just before new needle emergence. And these are not small changes. These are basically going from nothing to 10 to 12% or more of the dry mass of a needle is composed just of starch. So, but what you'll see is how pronounced this is. During the dip period, at the peak of the dip, we reach a maximum in starch content and then basically declines to nearly 0 for the entire rest of the season, all the way through January. So if we look at what explains these changes best, we'll see that that the amount of starch, sugar, and crude fat as a percent of dry weight is strongly correlated to foliar density, meaning that 85% of the variation in foliar density is explained just by these three components of the fuel. But keep in mind that these three components make up, in some cases, as much as 40% of the dry weight of that fuel. And so these are not trivial changes in the distribution of these compounds within it. And so if we look at the starch, sugar, and crude fat explaining the foliar density, the next interesting part is that the changes in foliar density explain 97% of the changes in the actual foliar moisture content. This plot actually, the only thing that it does is convert live foliar moisture content from a dry weight basis to a wet weight basis, which is what's plotted on the y-axis, and compare it to the foliar density that was measured on that fuel for that needle type at that time across the entire season. So, and this is for both jack pine and red pine combined. So these changes are consistent across both species, and it basically tells us that nearly everything that we're seeing as a change in the calculated live foliar moisture content is driven by changes in the dry weight of that fuel and not by changes in the absolute amount of water in that fuel. And I did want to say, if there's questions out there and you wanted to type them in, please feel free to do that. It's much better if we address them while they come up rather than having to sort back through and find them, so don't be shy. If we look at the time to ignition results, basically what we see is that under rapid heating, our burner can ignite these needles in about 4 seconds, 4 to 6 seconds, which is orders of magnitude higher than a lot of studies have reported. But it's very, very realistic in terms of what kind of conditions they would be introduced to in a wildfire. And what you see is that during the dip period between May and June is the period that recorded the shortest time to ignition, which means the highest flammability. And again, the shape of this curve nearly perfectly follows the shape of the spring dip curve. But as we're learning now, that dip is driven more by changes in the chemistry and less by changes in the actual amount of water in the fuel. And if we look at the relationship between foliar density and flammability, we see something that's kind of interesting, because in traditional combustion theory, as the density of something increases, its time to ignition should increase. But what we found is exactly the opposite, is that as the foliar density increases, the time to ignition decreases. So foliage with higher density is more flammable than foliage with lower density. And that's basically because the drivers of the density changes are simple sugars. And if you think about how your body works, if your body needs quick energy, the first place it goes to burn is the simple sugars and then complex sugars, and then it burns other things that release more energy but take more energy to break down later. So the initial pulse of energy comes from simple carbohydrates and starches. What we find is basically that live fuels may potentially work that same way, is that fuels that accumulate these simple sugars are also accumulating a source of energy that's easily pyrolyzed and easily accessible in a wildfire. So as the density increases, as a result of an increase in simple sugars and starches, that density increase is suggesting a change that we've never considered before, which is a change in the actual energy content of the fuel over time. The other thing that's important about the density change is that in the springtime, before new needles emerge, the volume of the tree crown is not changing. But we know from these density measurements that the actual total amount of biomass in any given volume of needles is increasing during this dip period, which basically means that we're increasing the total amount of energy of these forest stands during this dip period proportional to that change or to the increase in the particle density. So if we use some simulation modeling to try to assess how these differences play out in how these differences would play out at the stand scale in terms of fire behavior, what we did is, and these results are literally very preliminary because I just finished this morning, so bear with me. So I used the Wildland Urban Interface fire dynamic simulator that was developed by NIST, but is now mainly supported by Ruddy Mel out of the Pacific Northwest Research Station. Okay, I got a question from Matt. We'll hold off for just a second. It says, would transpiring needles take longer to ignite than non-transpiring needles? If so, how does that relate to your lab experiments? I think that basically are you talking about differences in over summer or? Whether evaporation is happening? I think that so the one thing that we found from other studies is that we still have a similar relationship, that water still matters, and that the absolute amount of water does play a role in the ignition of the needles. But what we found here is that the absolute amount of water doesn't necessarily relate to the doesn't necessarily relate to the live foliar moisture content that we measure, because we also measured the relative water content, and what we found there is that during the dip period that that relative water content was actually increasing during the dip period, which means that the trees themselves were actually getting more hydrated, but their apparent moisture content was going down because of these changes in dry weight. So I'm not sure if that gets at your question. Okay. So if we get back to basically we use the WF to simulate the impacts of this. And what we did is we constrained it such that the absolute amount of water stayed the same in two simulations, and all we did was change the actual bulk density of the fuel such that we increased the total amount of fuel in the volume while keeping the amount of moisture the same. And what we found was that during the period of the dip, we actually have a higher heat release rate during that period of maximum density, and we also have a longer duration. So we can see the width of this curve here, or the peak, versus the width of the similar curve behind it. You'll actually, if you did the integral, you'd see that there's more total energy released from these stands during the period of the dip. And this is just a way that we can start to decipher how all these impacts kind of combine to create the fire behavior that we see during this time of the year. So if we talk about putting it together, what does it all mean? It just says basically that foliar moisture content follows the documented trends. We definitely saw the spring dip in the observations, but the drivers of the dip is completely opposite of what we thought. So the dip itself is driven by a change in the foliar density and not necessarily a change in the water content. So it's conceivable that the water content of fuels is fairly conservative, but only varies as a function of transpiration within the year, but within some fairly narrow boundaries, and that would be whatever the relationship we couldn't explain with density changes alone. The density changes themselves were best correlated to sugar, starch, and crude fat, and they were primarily driven by this tenfold increase in starch content. So what it means is that if the total volume of the fuel stayed constant, there's basically more available fuel in the tree crowns during that dip period, and that the total bulk energy content, if you want to treat it as how much energy is in a tree crown in BTUs, that the heat content of that tree crown is going to increase during that dip period, and thus have the potential to generate more energy if they do ignite. And our flammability tests did support that. So if we look at this a little bit different way, what we see is that really the foliar moisture content is driven by two separate but related things. There's a change in the foliar water content, which we know from our relative water content measurements that there is some degree of that, and that it is important, and that we can most likely track those changes with, say, looking at leaf water potential or some other metric. On the right side, what we know is that the foliar dry matter is primarily driven by these density changes, and the density changes are mostly affected by the foliar chemistry. So, and all of those things are directly driven by photosynthesis and allocation. Some of the other things is that the foliar chemistry can actually affect the heat content of the fuel. So we know from another study that we're working on now that we can explain basically about 80% of the variation in heat content across 20 species or so just by knowing the amount of non-structural carbohydrates and crude fat. So basically the amount of starch, sugar, and crude fat in the foliage. All that kind of leads to this sort of effective yield at the stand scale of how much heat do I generate per mass of fuel that I have, and all of them combine to influence the ignitability. So if we just look at simply crude fat and heat content, we can see that basically we can explain about 93% of the variation in heat content just by knowing the crude fat alone. And these are, but it does get more complicated as we've added more species. So look at an example. The German Road Fire happened in Wisconsin this past year. It was either one of or the largest wildfire in that area in decades, I believe. And basically what we found is that we were able to sample right after the fire, taken adjacent to this area, and what we found is in that fire area, the red pine moisture content was 90%, the jack pine moisture content was 93.1%, but the starch content of those fuels was very consistent with the periods of the peak dip period that we observed at our adjacent site, so the starch content was almost 13% in red pine and about 11% in jack pine. So in an area with an intense wildfire, we see that they were indeed at the sort of trough of this dip period and at a peak in starch content. And unfortunately, we could only take this sort of snapshot in time there, but it really follows along with what we saw in other places. So the dip is primarily driven by photosynthesis. and the accumulations of starch. So basically, if we know that it's photosynthetic activity that's causing this dip, then what if we look for proxies for photosynthetic activity? And that's what we did. So we pulled basically a time series from MODIS, and this is just for a short time. The sort of dark line in the background is a MODIS GPP, or gross primary production, which is an indicator of the total amount of carbon that the vegetation is fixing over time. And what we see, the red line is actually the observed fire behavior for these 4 years. So a 3 or above is an indicator of crown fire activity, and generally anything 2 or below is an indicator of surface fire activity. And that's kind of a rough guide, but basically this is from John Hentz's work, where he documented every single day that they had a fire, what was the worst fire behavior they saw on that day. And what you see is that indeed, as the MODIS GPP increases here during the start of that dip period, that's when the fire activity starts to increase, right at the same time. So each year we have nearly a perfect coincidence with the increase in fire activity and the increase in photosynthetic activity. And if we use a similar metric, which is just weather driven, this is the growing season index. It's just a proxy, very similar to the MODIS GPP, a proxy of productivity, but it's something we can calculate every day. But it's meant to tell us when the growing season starts and when it ends. And what you'll see is that we get the same relationship with it, and this is over a 8-year time, or a 7-year in this case, time frame. And you'll see that as the growing season starts, so does the fire activity. Nearly every single occurrence. So the nice thing about this is it means that maybe we can actually predict when these conditions are going to start getting worse just by monitoring the weather and the fuel. So one of the things that Wagner said is that when he was talking about the dip is that for practical purposes, it was therefore assumed that its date is fairly constant from year to year and not much affected by annual trends of soil and air temperature. Well, what I found from, I pulled the foliar moisture content measurements that they've been doing for quite some time at the MEO site in Michigan, and basically what we see is that at a minimum, the timing of the lowest recorded moisture content varies by as much as a month at the same place. So in terms of fire management, that's a very important thing to capture, is that the interannual variations in the timing of this dip. And it's actually it varies by more than a month. So we have to figure out tools that allow us to capture what's causing these things to change. Van Wagner suggested this concept of this crown fire spread factor, and I think that we probably could eventually do something like that. But what you'll notice is this crown fire spread factor nearly perfectly, his sort of theoretical one, nearly perfectly follows our measurement of foliar density. So it's very possible that we can find we can develop a scaling parameter that allows us to assess these changes. And even moisture content alone isn't a bad proxy. It's just about how we interpret these changes over time, or how we interpret them over time from the same place. So basically, we know that foliar moisture content changes are driven by changes in density, and density is primarily driven by starch, sugar, and crude fat, but starch seems to be the most variable. And the interesting thing is that this sort of starch and sugar content linked to flammability has never really been seen before. And it could very well be that it's kind of been the missing link that helps us to assess changes in flammability throughout the season for other places. And basically both density or live fuel moisture can be used as a proxy for these changes. So the fact that you're measuring the fuel moisture is still not a bad thing. The dip timing isn't constant, but we know we can model the timing and length. One of the things that we need is more. We need some interest and support from other field folks that want to help us address this question a little more completely. We have a lot of interest in Minnesota, and we're going to bring some of them on board. We're going to expand our sampling in Wisconsin. Still looking for some folks in Michigan that want to join us in this endeavor, because if we can really start to get a bigger picture of this, we can start to basically address things like how does it vary as the growing season progresses from the south to the north, or how does it vary from east to west, or what are these drivers, are they the same everywhere? We can't really answer that. We only have this one preliminary site, but I think that more sites and more partners are going to lead to a much better picture of this whole thing. Josh, the samples were taken from Wisconsin Rapids, from right adjacent to the Rome RMRS station. So with that, I'll open it up to other questions, and we'll go from there.
Hey, Matt, you got a question from Paul.
Paul, we started sampling in March, and that's because honestly, I think that's about the right time to capture the lead up, even though that really for us it kind of happened in June. Matt, I think it we'll find that this is going to be the same thing in a lot of places. What we found is that that even here in western Montana, looking at Douglas fir, we have a spring dip in Douglas fir and in lodgepole pine, and we found the very same thing, that those things are driven by changes in density and changes in the chemistry. So Travis said, I mentioned the increasing density should actually increase the time to ignition, but we actually see the opposite. Do I believe that non-structural carbohydrates are held in a solution within the needles? If so, as near as I can tell, adding solutes lowers the specific heat, which should lend itself to lowering the ignition time. Have you looked down that path at all? And the answer is yes, and that's where we're really trying to use these physics-based fire behavior models to help us tease out all of these different components, because we know that the chemistry changes as the chemistry changes, all of the physical properties of that fuel change concurrently. So even if you have more sugars in solution in the needle, specific heat and the thermal conductivity and all of these things. So yeah, we're definitely going down that path, Travis.
Hey, Matt, we have another one from Paul.
So Paul,
okay.
I think one of the interesting things with the answer is well, I don't know that it pays to sample deciduous trees, but I think we still have to show what makes them different. We know that with those trees, there's a big geometry difference in the shape of the tree crowns and the shape of the leaves and all that stuff. So it becomes pretty hard to separate out what the influence of just a change in leaf shape is if we held everything else constant. And for example, we have a tree here in western Montana, a western larch, that doesn't burn at all, generally. But the reason that it doesn't burn very well is because it has a very low density of foliage. But when we take that same foliage and we put it into our ignition apparatus, we find out that it's actually very flammable. It's just that it never has fuel in a sufficient quantity in a small enough space to actually be able to ignite and spread. So I think we can still learn stuff from sampling deciduous trees. I don't know that we, for this study we stick with pines, but what I found is that we have similar relationships across all sorts of pine. The same relationships are across any pine that we look at. So we have some data from longleaf pine that follows some similar concepts. All of our lodgepole pine, ponderosa pine from here, and the jack pine, red pine from Minnesota or from Wisconsin all have the same. So
Jennifer Young just has a question. Says, has this been looked at in more mountainous regions and northern jurisdictions?
And Jennifer, we've seen very similar things in our lodgepole pine sites here, and they actually range from elevations from about 4,000 feet to 7,000 feet or so. So we have a pretty good coverage of mountainous regions here, but we don't have, in terms of the northern jurisdictions, I don't, that's one thing I really want to expand, is so that we can start looking at a bigger gradient of these things, particularly with respect to the timing of when that dip occurs. And I suspect that what we're going to see is that it follows the same progression as when the growing seasons start at higher latitudes.
Hey, Matt, you mentioned all these samples are taken in Wisconsin, but you're branching out hopefully into Minnesota, Michigan. Can you give a real brief summary of kind of the collection process, what's involved with those, in case anybody wants to get the samples?
Well, thanks to John Hentz's work, and we worked out a protocol that's really pretty simple, and I think that our plan for the next round is to kind of do a two-pronged approach. So if you have time to put in a little effort for some of the intensive sampling, that's probably about a 3-hour process for each sample period, whereas the other sampling of just maybe looking at just moisture contents as frequently as possible during the season could be very quick, especially if you have access to a sampling site close by to a place where you can weigh and dry things. So we are really hoping that we can get people to jump on board with one or the other of these, either the intensive or the sort of lightweight sampling, because even the one thing we see a lot of value in is just having these time series of foliar moisture contents like the ones that they have at MEO, and it's very valuable, I think, to be able to do that. And I think that if we can span a nice range across the states, we'll see that the timing of those dips staggered, and really be able to start relating it back to local weather conditions, which I think is driving it a lot. And John Hentz actually just put 2 soil temperature sensors on their RAS station, so that we'll have that data for next spring, for the next year as well. So that'll be nice to a nice secondary verification.
Okay. If we have people that are listening that are interested, should they contact you directly, email, Matt?
Yeah, so my email is just M as in Mike, Jolly as in Old St. Nicholas, at fs.fed.us. So mjolly at fs.fed.us, and you're welcome to drop me a note if you have anything.
Yeah, and if people can't find that, you're welcome to go into the Lake States Fire Science Consortium website. There's a web page that's set up specific to this webinar, and that also has Matt's contact information. Or you're welcome to get that your request to me, and I can forward that to Matt. Matt, I got another question, because we're talking about, obviously the value to this for wildfire, trying to predict wildfire season a little better. Can you kind of do a comparison between wildfire season versus those that are looking at this for prescribed fire operations?
Well, I think that's one of the things that we're going to do here this spring, actually, is we have an area on the Beaver Head Deer Lodge that is a regen from a 2000 fire, and but we're going to do prescribed burning in that to see if this actually happens during that time period, so that, because I think, you know, during prescribed burning season, a lot of times people see a lot of like torching activity or in trees that where they just didn't expect it. And I actually think that this may explain a lot of that, is just where is that tree in relation to where is that tree in relation to its growth cycle, and how does that affect its flammability during that time? And that's something that, you know, if we do this right and it continues to pan out, you could use this to your advantage in a prescribed burning scenario, where if you know that this tree is peaked out and it's stored carbohydrates and it's not greening up yet, and that makes it fairly flammable, you could actually, if there was some management activity that you needed to achieve with fire to, say, reduce one species and keep another, this might give you a tool to be able to do that. So I think that it will lead a lot to it, to a better understanding. I got two questions I'll get to. So Jennifer, I don't think that that having the sampling sites close to a weather station is a constraint. I definitely think that just, you know, being able to take the actual fuel samples and you know what date they're taken, the rest of the stuff, when we start relating it back to weather, we can actually pull on any number of other resources, maybe gridded weather or something like that, to get to that. And Paul, if you will drop me an email, I'll send you the PowerPoint.
Yep, and just for Paul and others, you know, this is being recorded too, so it will be available as a recording, and that'll be put up on the Lake State Fire Science Consortium website shortly after we're done today. Give me a little time to get it up, but either tomorrow or the beginning of next week we'll have it up. All right, I don't see any more questions. Any final thoughts, Matt?
Just if anybody out there wants to talk about it or has any comments, you're welcome to just call or drop me a note. I'd love to hear from you.
That's great. All right. Well, I would like to thank Matt and everyone online for joining us this afternoon. This was a great webinar. Again, if you'd like to review the webinar or share with someone that might be interested but missed it, a recording of the webinar will be available on the Lake States Fire Science Consortium website. I want to also take the opportunity here before we conclude to highlight our next webinar. It's going to be on March 27th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central. This will be characterizing wildlife communities of fire-dependent ecosystems of the northern lake states and exchanging research, inventory, and monitoring knowledge and ideas. And that'll be by Dr. Gregory Porras. Finally, I would encourage all of you to please take a few seconds to provide us with some feedback in today's webinar. When we close out the webinar window, you should get a short web-based survey that'll pop up. Please fill that out. The survey information is very important to help us better serve your fire science needs. So that concludes today's webinar. Thanks again to Matt and everyone for participating today. Matt, if you could just hang on the line here a little bit after I put up the audio and the recording.
Okay.